would like to present to you today my PhD project with the working title, Linking Wealth and Power, a class analysis of the bourgeoisie in the 21st century. And here to the left, you see a painting actually by a German painter, Christian Schad from the 1920s, which I thought kind of captures the stereotypes of what I'm trying to describe here quite well. So we were asked to formulate our claims at the very beginning. And if I try to break it down to only a few, at least for this presentation, because this is actually a presentation of the broader project of at least 2 papers, I guess. So I'm not going into depth on many things here, but what I would like to speak about today is actually that we should not worry too much about power of the rich in democratic capitalism. The rich are not a powerful group per se, but powerful are those who control the means of production, i.e. the capitalist class. And this class, I think, is defined by their positions in the economic system. And these positions are their source of structural power in democratic capitalism. So in other words, I would like to apply a class perspective to the analysis of the super rich and their power in democratic capitalism. And by measuring these structural class positions, we can map the capitalist class and show how it takes class action through its firms. So to begin with, maybe the motivation was maybe when I started this project was Thomas Piketty's work on capital in the 21st century from 2014. And here especially his RGG hypothesis. So many of you might know the graph here to the right, which shows the rate of return on capital, which is supposed to be, was larger than the average growth rate of the economy since about the 1970s. And is projected to continue to be higher. And that means that those individuals and families who already possess large amounts of capital basically will accumulate more and more capital, if this is correct actually. And this obviously was hotly debated from the start. So it is still an ongoing debate whether this hypothesis is actually accurate on the one hand. So there's some good support, especially in the long run, but also it is also challenged in the shorter run already by an IMF study. But it also sparked a pretty big normative discussion surrounding the question of wealth inequality and wealth concentration. And in this discussion, obviously, there were a lot of different standpoints. I mean, there's also a pretty brilliant contribution to this, I think, by Deirdre McCloskey from the University of Chicago from a more economically liberal standpoint. And the question is raised why we should devote scientific attention at all to the rich from this perspective. And one of the arguments that was always raised by left observers and participants in this discussion was that the assumption that the concentration of wealth and might be related also to a concentration of political power, and that this would threaten democracy in a way, or at least on a normative level, would challenge the principle of one person, one vote in a way. And there are a lot of empirical contributions, some more recent, like the work by Martin Gilens or Larry Bartels on a responsiveness bias. They found that politicians are more responsive to the preferences of the wealthy than the average citizen in a way. But there's also older works, such as the many editions of Bill Domov's work on Who Rules America, or Colin Redmill's classic The Power Elite, who describes a relationship between different types of elites and how they basically concentrate power in a way. And this was kind of the first motivation of the project, because when I tried to do some research on this, I kind of thought that still the mechanisms of this weren't quite clear and how this is supposed to work exactly. And this was also quite scarce in the normative debate from my point of view. So this motivated me to look into this a bit more in detail. And I think one crucial starting point to understand the question of why wealth concentration should be related to a concentration of political power is to understand who we even mean when we speak about the rich. So, I mean, one obvious distinction would be the differentiation between income and wealth, which has become more prominent recently. But there's also others, such as the origin of wealth, right? I mean, you could, for example, come up with these groups here. So you, on the one hand, have the years of large fortunes, such as Susanne Klatten or Stefan Quandt from the BMW family of fortune. And you also have Liliane Bettencourt, who is the year of the L'Oréal fortune in Paris, and I think still the richest woman in the world, actually. So these people just inherited large amounts of wealth from their families. Then you have the yeah, you could say superstar managers is I think how Piketty calls them. So these are people who sometimes have worked their way up in a way in the class structure, if you want so, and they are very high on the income distribution and most often not very high on the wealth distribution. So they're not among the top billionaires or something, but they earn huge amounts of income. And then you have the classic firm founders. So these are the billionaires that you often think about, like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, or the German example. Many of the rich Germans somehow are grocery chain owners. Yeah, these are would be the classic people who founded a company, which then got really big, and so they got billionaires in a way. And then you have more or less like a miscellaneous category, I would say. For example, the entertainers, so Jay-Z and Beyonce. I also assume to have a net worth of a couple of $100 million, I think. The same with David Beckham. But if you're interested in the question of who among the rich we should focus on or should be worried about when we think about concentration of political power, then I think this will not apply equally to all of these groups. And as an answer to this question, I think we should apply a class perspective to understand the super rich and who among the rich we should be worried about. And here, usually I talk about why I use a Marxist class scheme and come from a Marxist tradition in distinction to the Weberian one, actually. I'm not quite sure how many Weberians are here today, but so I would rather spend only a few words on why I think the Marxist tradition is could help us here to describe this class category and also the more fundamental economic developments that are happening. So on the one hand, I think that the Marxist tradition obviously always had this distinction of the ownership of the means of production within it, and therefore always included wealth in a way, and especially ownership of capital. But also, I mean, it is about the relationship between the class structure and the general mode of production, right? So in the Marxist tradition, classes were not only a descriptive category, but they were describing or basically describing groups that are also political groups. They take class action, they take political action, and they then form the class structure again and are related to capitalism, right? So they challenge capitalism or they try to defend it. And this, I think, can be really helpful and is relevant, again, for example, because of the consequences of Piketty's RGG hypothesis. So obviously, when the owners of capital accumulate more and more capital, this might result in problems of legitimization of capitalism, which might be relevant for class consciousness and discourse, for example, or class interests, right? I mean, if you speak about questions of wealth redistribution, but also, I mean, dispossession, for example, which is sometimes debated already. And for this, obviously, a distinction between ownership of the means of production and non-ownership is relevant, of course. And then maybe only why I think, or why I'm using Eric Goldenwright. So this is something I read a lot and I'm drawing on a lot, the work by him. And I think his work especially, and more generally, the structuralist Marxist work can help us, or at least me and my ambition here, to rather describe empirically this large group of the super rich globally. So I think it's much too simple to think of a ruling class in a simple way. So basically, people who, I don't know, wear smokings and smoke cigars in some back rooms with politicians and make all the important decisions or something. What I'm trying to do here is really to measure and understand structural class positions of a large amount of people. So, I mean, I have a list of 15,000 super rich, global super rich individuals. And I would try to measure a more subtle way of how this class takes structural political action. And this is why I think the work, for example, by structural Marxists, such as Eric Goldenwright, is really helpful for doing this. So if we stick to his terminology and maybe, for example, look at these suggested interrelations of class structure, class formation, and class struggle, I think this can help already to build a new scheme to understand the capitalist class and then also try to describe it empirically. So to begin with class structure, I mean, some of you might have seen this before. This is one of the prominent class schemes that are often used in quantitative sociology, especially in survey research, to classify individuals along a couple of dimensions. I mean, often survey questions or something, and then to assign every individual in a society their class position, basically. And here, So this top category, even within the right scheme, and there are, I mean, others are more prominent, actually more widely used, such as the Goldthorpe scheme from a Weberian perspective, include all individuals that own means of production, which is the left column, but also have 10 or more employees. I mean, this obviously is a very broad category. So that includes more or less the owner of the pizza place next door and Bill Gates. So that's obviously much too broad. And yeah, I think we have to think of ways to describe this, this category more accurate. And reasons for this are that in the past century, I mean, class analysis were especially interested in describing the working class or especially middle classes, but the top category, such as the bourgeoisie, was often a bit left behind from my perspective. So then, I mean, drawing on Wright again, I mean, he also made the distinction, or he came up with an answer to the question of how the separation of ownership or legal ownership of the means of production and control could be solved from a Marxist class analysis stance. And that is by introducing this concept of contradictory class locations. So I won't go into detail here again, but the point is that this also includes top corporate executives, because if they have control within their corporations, so if they are actually the ones who make the investment decisions, if they are the ones who control the physical means of production and so on. So this includes everyone who de facto has the control in a firm and controls the capital that is owned by this firm. So in other words, and again, this is something I could speak about more, especially about the operationalization, which is still somewhat tricky for me. It is very relevant how these members of the capitalist class and how these owners of the means of production are actually involved in their firms and who has control within these firms. So one dimension, therefore, in terms of the class structure is the control over the means of production, according to Wright. And I think, so a second category, relevant category, if you want to describe class action of the capitalist class, is then class formation. And for Wright, this can also be social networks. And I think it could be worthwhile to draw on the long tradition of the sociology of economic elites here, and especially the concept of interlocking directorates. So I don't know if you're all familiar with this, but the concept is that so most companies worldwide have a board of directors, and there are some individuals who sit on multiple of these boards and thereby connect different firms and build a network, basically. Which I think we can understand as a way of class formation, and maybe as a proxy for class formation. And as I said, there's a very long tradition. I mean, first studies go back to the beginning of the 20th century and include famous studies such as the one by Michael Useem, analyzing a highly interlocked inner circle of the economic elite in the UK and US, who then influenced policy, or Mark Mizrachi's work on the structure of corporate political action. And actually until today, so I mean, this is Josh Murray's study from 2017, it is shown that these interlocks are related to firm political action. So if a firm is more interlocked in these kind of networks, then it shows more political action in terms of, for example, party contributions or lobbying. Yeah, and again, I would propose that we understand these networks and these ties as a structural way of class formation. So according to Mizrachi, how he defined it once is that these interlocks have the function that they are centers through which information of relevance to the entire corporate community was exchanged and transmitted. They are a source of normative consensus and stability among the leaders of the largest corporations. And they are a source of cognitive range or breadth and outlook in terms of concern for the larger business community as well as the larger society. So to sum up to this point, I think two relevant categories to stratify more this uppest category of the bourgeoisie in capitalism today could be a first dimension of control over capital. So it's individuals and groups with effective control over the means of production via powerful positions within their firms. And thereby they have a potential for class action that results from structural power and democratic capitalism, or in other words, that politicians are also dependent on economic success, basically, and thereby are also interested in basically a flourishing economy and investment flows going and so on. So there is this interdependency, and those individuals who control large amounts of capital are very relevant for politicians as well. And there is this interdependency, so they have structural power. And second, I suggest that there is an integration as a class, for example, through channels such as interlocking directorates, where a common perspective is generated and information flows. So then, based on this, you can come up with a categorization to stratify among this top category, according to Wright, on the one hand, a potential for structural economic power, so the degree of control over the relative means of production, for example, as control of revenue in percent of the national global revenue. And on the second dimension, on the level of integration, so the degree of integration in interlock networks. And then you would have, you could expect variation, for example, in terms of those who are both, so they are very interlocked in the interlocking directorates networks, and they control large amounts of capital, which, I don't know, you could call the established inner circle bourgeoisie. And you have those who control large amounts of wealth, but they're not very integrated in the interlock networks or in the class formation process. And then you might have something like capitalist networkers who are very interlocked, but they don't themselves control large amounts of capital. And then you would have something like the ordinary bourgeoisie. So they are also obviously have control over capital, but they're neither extraordinarily interlocked, nor do they control large amounts of capital. And this is something that I would like to work with and play this through, whether this way we can meaningfully describe the capitalist class. And how I would like to do that in the project is to look at class struggle, like I said, as a form of structural class action, which I try to measure by looking at firm political action. So in other words, what do I expect? So those who control large amounts of capital should have much at stake. So that is affected by policies. So they should have high incentives to try to influence policy processes. And they should be able to use their position of structural power to get access to the political process, for example, by meetings with the European Commission. So they have a lot of opportunities as well to communicate their interests, right? So as a first hypothesis, I expect this dimension, or people who are high on this dimension, to increase the odds of a firm to take political action if they are involved in a firm. Second, those who are highly interlocked, it's similar because they should be well aware of a general interest of capital, if you will, across sectors especially, and possibly therefore also have more of a class consciousness or an awareness of class interests in terms of policy, and might therefore also have more of incentives and stronger interests to engage in political action or in class action. And then just to, I assume just a simple additive effect, for example, for those who are both, so the highly interlocked inner circle bourgeoisie, I would expect that they have the highest chance to increase lobbying of a firm. So then how do I try to check whether this is correct actually, or whether I can find support for this? I'm using 4 data sources for the empirical part. And that is one large data set of company data from the so-called Orbis database, which includes names of management, names of shareholders, and financial data for up to 3.2 million firms, actually. And second, I do have a list of about 15,000 global super rich individuals gathered from public sources by a private researcher in Cologne. And I'm mainly mainly matching these names with the Orbis data to find these individuals among shareholders or management. And then as an outcome, I'm using data on firm lobbying in the US to Congress, so the LobbyView database, and in the EU to the LobbyFacts database, which includes lobbying costs to Parliament and meetings with the European Commission. So far, there's only preliminary results, but yeah, the data cleaning is still ongoing and my research design is not final, but I would still like to give you a first insight into my results. So first of all, as a first check of plausibility, the largest component of the US interlocking directorate network in 2018, you can see it here in, at the right. So this includes about 17,800 individuals, which are involved in an overall of 482,000 firms and on their boards of directors and or senior management. And as so these orange nodes are actually super rich individuals. So the first check of plausibility then basically is, does this even make sense, right? So are those who potentially control large amounts of capital also interlocked in interlocking directorate networks? And this seems to be the case. So they are there and they are interlocked partly. So yeah, I mean, this is already a first check of plausibility that I could at least work with this. And just I picked out a couple of prominent examples just to show you who's in my data basically, or what kind of data I have here. And that is, yeah, I mean, includes Rupert Murdoch, but also the Wexners and the Swedish Wallenberg family. But again, also Susanne Klatten and Stefan Quandt, and they are all pretty central in this US interlocking directed network of 2018, as well as Carl Icahn, for example, who I'm going to use as an example a couple of times because he's just very prominent in my data. So then I try to map these four categories again on these two dimensions. So on the one hand, the interlocking directorate network, and here especially interlocks outside the own sector. And the second dimension, the revenue that is controlled by these individuals. And these four categories, you can see that Carl Icahn would be an example of this established inner circle bourgeoisie, for example. So he seems to be highly interlocked also across sectors and controls large amounts of capital. And then there's other people, such as, for example, James C. France, who's the NASCAR guy. I don't know, I wasn't familiar to him before, but you might be. And he seems to be highly interlocked, but himself does not control a lot of capital. So here I would expect, yeah, different forms of political action in a way. So what I then did as a first preview is to run a logistic regression on firm political action with these categories or types of involvement of the capitalist class as independent variables. And this also includes quite a few control variables. So I'm controlling for sector and year, and also whether it's a US firm or not. And I do find some significant effects. So these are odds ratios, but they do not really fit the picture that I was expecting. So you can see at the top, the established inner circle bourgeoisie, which I expected to be the strongest category in a way, have the strongest effect. It does increase the odds of a firm to meet the European Commission by 3 times when an individual from this category is involved in a firm. And this is similar with the lobbying in the EU Parliament. But for the US, though it is positive, the effect, it's much smaller than for the EU. And that is similar in the next category. The powerful individual capitalists, for some reason, seem to have a very strong effect in the US. So they increase the odds of a firm to engage in lobbying to the US Congress by about 7 times, but it's much lower for the EU. So this is kind of puzzling why this should be the case. I mean, some first explanation could be seen in the next category. So the capitalist networkers, again, seem to have a large effect on political action, firm political action in the EU, but not in the US so much. So in other words, this could tell us that the interlocking directed networks, so class formation, could be stronger or work this way more in the EU. So, and then I have more or less a reference category of those firms who are only have powerful management, and here the odds seem to decrease even. So it especially seem to be these 3 categories which are either high on the dimension of control over capital or on interlocking directorates. So there are obviously still a lot of open questions, among others, that some of this variation can be explained by the suggested types of involvement of the capitalist class. But do these firms actually also behave similarly? That is a question I have to check with other methods actually, and that I would like to do. Also, obviously a very relevant question is there a division of labor in political action within the capitalist class? Or are they just distinct groups? I mean, this is obviously relevant. I have to think of ways of how to test this and make this more clear, whether we can actually speak of a class sensibly or not. And finally, I would also like to check what role exactly families or kinecon groups, as Seitling calls them in the 70s, play and how they are involved in different kinds of firms and how this is distributed among the super rich. So yeah, I'm planning to finish these papers by the end of this year or maybe next year. And yeah, so we'll see what the final results are. If you're interested, stay tuned. And thanks a lot for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the discussion very much. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lukas, for your presentation. And I'm excited to see any further results that you might get from this study. So once again, I'm going to turn comments over to Jeff in a moment, but just to let the audience know that you can submit questions while Jeff is responding. And then after Jeff is done and Lucas has given his responses to those, then we'll open it up to the general audience. So Jeff, take it away.
All right, thanks, Lucas. You let me know ahead of time that it would be most helpful to focus on suggestions for the most promising avenues to kind of move this project forward. And so I'm happy to oblige. I think for me, the most promising avenues to develop this project involve exploiting, pardon the pun, the unique and kind of detailed data that you have on business and wealth ownership to answer questions about like the factionalization versus the sort of unity or organization of the capitalist class and the consequences of this factionalization or unity for, you know, the functioning of democratic governments and the reproduction of inequality over time. So I read your paper really as like an inquiry into the extent to which the capitalist class is like segmented or internally stratified, and then whether these internal divisions are linked with their influence or their engagement with politics. So I'll throw out some questions for you to grapple with that I think might help you to kind of move the analysis toward a more complete answer. I mean, some of these issues you might not be able to deal with the data that you have, but maybe there's other data that you could incorporate into the project. So a lot of your analysis sort of engages with this question about whether there are certain types of capitalists who are more likely to take action into the general interest of capital. And so I wanted to hear more about exactly what the general interest of capital is. Is it protection of the institution of private property? Is it easy access to credit and a compliant labor force? Is it insurance against chaotic and unpredictable markets, something else? But what exactly do you think is general among the group of capitalists? And then sort of related to this, these questions is what do actions in pursuit of those general interests look like? Is it just lobbying Congress, or does it matter what Congress is being lobbied for or against, right? A lot of the lobbying Bill Gates did, for instance, in the 90s, right, was like against antitrust enforcement of other capitalists that he was taking advantage of, right? I don't know if that's in the general interest of capital, right? Or maybe it is. But in any case, you know, what exactly is being lobbied for or against, I think, is an important question to engage with here. And then other forms of political engagement that I think are important and that you might be able to get data on would be like subvention of political candidates, funding for nonprofit organizations with an ideological mission or ostensibly a research mission. So yeah, in general, I just encourage you to think more deeply about, you know, what the general interests are that might unite this heterogeneous group as a class, and then how different factions within this group, you know, might have differential attachment or methods of pursuing them. And then the other question I had was, you know, what are the most likely dimensions along which the capitalist class might be segmented or factionalized? So you highlight the contrast between, you know, the owner of the pizza shop and Bill Gates, you know, to suggest the importance of the volume of capital owned by an individual and the degree to which, you know, they're networked with other economic actors, which are surely important. I mean, I think you have to include those, but, you know, there's a number of other dimensions that I think the capitalist class is, you know, internally differentiated along, and that are probably especially important for political engagement. So One, I think, is the extent of the product diversification. Are they operating in one product market or multiple product markets? The geographic scale of their markets. Do their product markets cross administrative or national boundaries, right? Their reliance on intellectual property, or in general forms of property that really require state enforcement of property protections in order to ensure profitability for. The extent of their reliance on public infrastructure, their sensitivity to antitrust enforcement, and so on. I think the volume of capital and the degree of sort of network cohesion among the group is certainly an important place to start, but that there's another, I think, of other kind of interesting dimensions to have a look at that might shed kind of some additional light on sort of which faction among this heterogeneous group is sort of really driving the political agenda. So, thanks.
Great. Yeah. Should I just respond? Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, thanks. This is really helpful. And I mean, you're absolutely right on all of your points. So I mean, the whole general interest of capital thing is obviously correct. I mean, I was referring there to a text by Klaus Offer, I think, where I read a pretty good conceptualization of this, but I couldn't really come up with the one issue that I could think of now. And also it has been a while that I read this text because the last couple of months, I honestly just spent in the depth of my Python script. So I would have to read that again. But I mean, one thing that I was thinking of, and because my data is also from 2010 to 2018, there was this trade deal between the US and Europe. I just forgot what it was called. I think the Canadian one was called CETA. So I was thinking that maybe that could be something where at least across several sectors, there should be like a similar interest. And maybe that could be a good point in time where I could show something where different sectors take similar political action. But overall, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this will be the exception. And I will have to think more about how I can describe this, this fracturing properly, and maybe also zoom in more into sectors or maybe something like fractions of capital. And also, I mean, these are very good suggestions of other dimensions that I could have a look at. I will definitely do that. I know that, for example, Josh Murray in his paper on these transnational interlocks and so on, he also included like whether firms do have a lot of public contracts and so on. I mean, I would have to find a data source for that, but I think I saw already something like that, at least for the EU. So that would definitely also be a good idea. And also maybe I should think again about looking at party contributions as well, and maybe like try to replicate one of these studies either by Josh Murray or by Anne Herwick on the issue, and see whether I can find maybe some additional explanatory power with that. So yeah, these are all very good suggestions, and I would definitely think about it and try to pick it up for the future development of this project. So thanks a lot.
All right, it looks like we've got a hand from Chicago Girls 1 and 2. So if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, go for it.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Lucas. We wanted to ask you a question about sort of also the what is to be done question, like, is it about overcoming capitalists, or is there a perspective in which it could also be about overcoming capitalism? And I guess in that regard, do you make a distinction between capital and capitalists, or the interests of capital and the interests of capitalists?
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I can just answer on the go now, because I haven't really, thought about this before, because the focus of this was not really to, so far, not really to come up with a solution or something, or the what is to be done question, but rather as a form of criticism in a way, and describe how basically this class from these class position takes political action, and thereby also like reproduces the capitalist system in a way. So I wouldn't know. I mean, I guess if you would have more like associations basically, or if you would collectivize the large corporations, for example, right? I mean, if you would, I don't even know what would be the English term for that? You would collectivize it and you would not have the private ownership anymore, but you would have, like, for example, only these boards who make the decisions. I mean, that could make a difference, but I'm not quite sure whether it will solve the problem, right? So I guess the answer is, or what I tried to give also in the presentation and in the project so far, that I don't think, obviously, it is the individuals. It is the individuals, right, who are the problem, but rather the structural positions. And at the moment, at least, these structural positions involve ownership, private ownership of these means of production. And this is why you have these self-interest involvements in politics. So I guess this is the only answer I can give you right now, because I hadn't really thought about it in depth before.
I actually had a thought on this as well. I think, Zeitlin talks about, or it might be right, when he's comparing sort of the kind of political activities of when he's using his kind of like, 3x3 table of wage laborers, and then the kind of 3x1 column of capitalists. He compares Sweden and the United States and shows that in Sweden, there's a much larger kind of extended working class block that includes supervisors of various levels and experts. And he argues that one of the reasons for this is that in the United States, white collar workers are very under organized. And part of the reason is that in the United States, it's often illegal for managers to join bargaining units. And that's not the case in Sweden. And you see that there's a much larger kind of working class or extended working class constituency. So I think that kind of like labor law angle is part of how you sort of move towards more of a socialization of the kind of large firm. But yeah, I'm seeing actually a question in our Q&A from Walter Van Michels. So Walter, if you want to unmute and ask your question, feel free. You should be allowed to speak now.
Yeah. I should be unmuted.
Yep, we can hear you.
And I don't know if I'm visible. I don't know how to make myself visible. But I actually just thought it was worthwhile to think more about, or that, I mean, it was a really interesting presentation, think more about the question that everybody's raised, which is the relation between the interests of capital and the interests of capitalists. Because while in one sense, they're obviously different, and that's why you're being asked that question, there's another sense in which it might not be clear how different they are. That is, it's conceivable to make a kind of argument that, even if Bill Gates or whatever is really lobbying and exerting power for the interests of Microsoft as opposed to the interests of many other capitalist firms, that is, his relative success in doing so is nonetheless in the service of the interest of capital. So that the question of what capitalist general interest was would in fact be answered not so much by an appeal to what do the capitalist class as lots of individual capitalists, but rather the success of the lobbying or even the failure of the lobbying, but in terms set in effect by capital. So in effect, what looks like, I mean, I don't know if this is true, I haven't thought about it at all until just a second. And it was really the way the Chicago girls put it that made me think of it, it was totally useful, is that the question would be, is that, well, it may well be the case that actually when the individual capitalist is lobbying on his own behalf, it's precisely because it's on his own behalf and not on behalf of other capitalists that it nonetheless does serve something like that you might call the general interest of capital.
Does anyone want to respond to that? Lucas or Chicago Girls or Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, guess maybe I'll just clarify why I asked the question. I mean, I think for me, what I was asking about is in, most capitalist societies that have achieved some degree of stability, like the general interest of capital is basically like hegemonic and taken for granted and not lobbied about, right? Like Bill Gates is not lobbying the U.S. government over like nationalization or like to protect, you know, like what I would think of as the general interest of capital. And so what you're likely to capture by looking at these different dimensions among the capitalist class are, you know, the interests of specific capitalists and their particular interests. And maybe there's a way that you can tie them up into some of these more general things. But to my mind, you know, it's there's sort of the general interests of capital are just taken for granted and not challenged, and are just reflected in the common sense by which government operates. And then it's the particular interests of capitalists around which there's like this vigorous debate and sort of political jockeying and so forth. And that's what you're more likely to capture.
But it would sort of be true, right, that in arguing for a certain set of political interests, like for example, or of individual interests, like in arguing against various forms of regulation that would harm Microsoft, but would help others, that is, one success also succeeds in altering the structure of the capitalism that you're working with. So it's not, you know, I mean, I totally take your point. There is a kind of background that is a hegemonic background, but actually, as we all know, even just the last 30 years, that background undergoes lots of changes. And in fact, it may well be that it's because of competition among individual capitalists that in effect, you're going to produce a different sense of what counts as the kind of default capitalism that is accepted. So from that standpoint, there would be a way of sort of trying to articulate the degree to which a certain set of individual concerns that are purely on behalf of, just sticking with Microsoft, in fact, succeed in altering the structure of the kind of what now will look like capitalism's slightly different general interest from what it looked like, let's say, before Microsoft.